All right, back again with Breya, and this is a continuation of the last video. So in that one, I actually went through a number of losses. I was experiencing challenges playing the deck because I didn't have enough disenchants to deal with fast starts. And it's funny because in the past, I've actually sort of focused on that as being very important, but I allowed myself to drift away from that principle because I um, I sort of got complacent by facing a lot of low-powered opponents. And when you're facing low-powered opponents, they typically lean on suboptimal, excuse me, strategies. And so what that ends up doing is it ends up making you feel like the cards that you need to protect yourself from the most powerful strategies feel somewhat useless. And so you're sitting holding a bunch of cards that you need against strong starts and thinking, well, this just makes the game go slower, right? Like I'm still going to win this game, but I'm going to win it more slowly because I'm holding these cards and waiting for the cards that I need to beat this opponent. And while the lower powered opponent may not be a threat to you, it makes it even more tedious. You don't really want to play those games out. You certainly don't want to concede in those games, but you also don't want to like drag them on. And so it you start thinking, well, what about this other card that I've been interested in? This will make me go faster. This sounds interesting. This sounds good. I'll be fine. I only need a few uh, defensive cards. I've got plenty. Look, I've got extras in my hand. That kind of thinking starts happening, and at least for me. And so I ended up drifting that direction. Then I played a bunch of test games against high-powered decks and realized my mistake. There's a reason why you need a lot of cheap disenchants. Main reasons are, of course, soul rings. Uh, the the thing is, and I'll use mono blue as an example because that's where the games were played recently. Against mono blue, their weakness is that they can't. It's funny because people like see the fast mana and they say this isn't good for the health of the format, but it's actually quite the opposite because mono blue is a very dominant strategy. And one of the things that holds it back from being a completely, just running completely rampant and totally dominating the format is the fact that it doesn't have many effective tools to deal with a fast start, and your opponents can. So if you're facing mono blue and they've got a fast start and you can slow them down with cheap early interaction and bring them back to reality, then your fast start becomes more powerful than theirs. And so now they're kind of they're behind on mana, and if they're mono blue and they're trying to play either combo or control, being way behind on mana makes it a lot harder for them to get their game plan going. And so that kind of like keeps them in check. Well, if you give up half of that equation, you give up your ability to deal with their fast starts and bring them back to reality, then they get to play a game that they can play successfully, which means say you get a fast start and they get a fast start. Well, now you're on even footing, and now they're mono blue and they have an advantage over you because it's going to be very difficult for you to make a play when they're able to both make a play and play a counter as part of the sequence of turns as it rotates through their turn to your turn and back to them again. Their ability to play on both players' turns because they have a ton of mana is a problem for you. So it makes those games a lot harder, and unless you get something like a Cavern of Souls draw where you can put pressure on them and force them to have to make plays on their turn, which will allow you to push through spells on yours, the game gets really challenging. On the other hand, if you have really cheap artifact and enchantment removal, particularly artifact removal, well then frequently they're cheap enough that you can get under counters, or if you make a play like casting a 1-mana Fragmentize and they counter it with a 2-mana counter, they're actually you can actually use it as bait and then run out something even more devastating like a Doretti or a Dak Vaden or something and really make the punish. So it's important to have these kinds of interactions. And when I had the losses in the last video, I kind of realized that, and so I made the adjustment. And now we're going to move into some games where you're going to see post-adjustment how I do against Mono Blue, which is specifically an artifact-based deck. So that's going to be one of the most that's going to be the ones that's very challenging, but it also lines up very well with running extra artifacts and enchantment kill. And then some random pickup games that I played against, or I was playing against anybody. They're still challenging, and you'll see why. But I think it's important to get back to, I need to make sure that I don't continuously test against mono blue and become and build a deck that's designed to beat them and and make myself weak against the field. So more testing will be required to make sure that I haven't weakened myself against the field, but I find it really difficult to believe that adding more disenchants, which kill the biggest threats in the format, um, is actually going to weaken me against anybody. So an example of a deck where it might would probably be something along the lines of I forget what is he Sorin? I forget, but anyway, there's the red, white, black vampire who creates a 1/1 vampire whenever your opponent plays a vampire. So it just sits in the command zone and produces extra vampires for them. And a deck like that, which typically isn't really running much by way of artifacts and enchantments. I mean, obviously it'll run a few, but typically not a lot. And you might find that they just get a really fast, aggressive start, and you've got a bunch of disenchants. And however, uh, you've got to keep in mind also that this is a 40 life format. So having disenchants when your opponent's being aggressive like that, you're still going to have time to naturally find solutions before you lose typically. And the biggest solution, of course, to that situation is the commander in this deck. So even though you might not draw like a Toxic Deluge or something, you still have Breya to lean on. So it actually makes artifacts and enchantments even more important to kill because Breya will do a lot of the work for you, and having 40 life will do a lot of the work for you that you need to get to the rest of the game. But if you take that same vampire start and then you add in something like a skull clamp on their side of the board, or you add in something like I forget what the other one is, but you get the picture. Skull clamp's probably the most horrifying card that they could have, where every vampire draws them 2 cards, right? You add something like that in there, and suddenly there's like the imperative to get a disenchant is absolutely critical, far more critical than getting, say, the Toxic Deluge that I mentioned earlier. So, and that's a good example of how you can see where what I'm saying, the fact that artifacts and enchantments must be removed in a timely fashion when you're trying to play the containment game. And so that's it. So we're going to run through some games, and we'll keep an eye on whether or not, like I said, I run into an issue perhaps against mono green where they go with a bunch of elves and then they make giant plays like tooth and nail, and the whole time I'm sitting there with disenchants. But once again, while that is a threat, certainly that becomes like vastly more impossible to contain as soon as you add in the early Sylvan Library, right? So or an early Soul Ring. So I don't expect that this is incorrect. I expect that the results will bear that out, but it's still early, and well, let's take a look at some of the results, and time will tell. So I'm going to go into my game history here and go into the last 7 days. And I believe I left off, I had played against KG here, and I'd run through, and I had all these losses with the low disenchant count. And then you can see for 30 minutes I sat there thinking about what I needed to do, and finally realized I needed to pull the trigger. I kept feeling like I wanted more disenchant effects, and I finally said, you know what, I'm just going to put, I used to have all these cards in the deck, and I took them out, and I was like, I'm just going to put them back in and see if I was onto something in the beginning or what. And then I had to make some painful cuts. I have actually cut Chromatic Lantern, which is the card that, of all the cuts, that's the one that hurts the most. I'm still not sure about it, but they did print Arcane Signet, and it's certainly better than Lantern. So I don't know if that's a adequate substitute or if Lantern should come back in or what. But for now, it's out. And anyway, it served me well, though, as you can see. So I'll play the rest of the KG match. And so we have a number of games there. It looks like 10, 12 games there. And then I'll run through these games against this random Rototaro, who brought progressively more difficult decks, I believe. I know that at the end he certainly upgraded to what I believe is probably his serious deck. right? And then I've got this random game against Dragon 7K. So we'll run through those and we'll see how everything worked out. And but we're going to start with this. I think I ended on this game actually. And yeah, there was that break, and then we move on to this game here where I've actually got all the full set of Disenchants. It actually starts with the 2L here. So we'll get started here. I'm pretty sure this has the I'm pretty sure this has the full set. If there are any cards in here that aren't part of the full set, I'll point them out as cards that were later upgraded. But I think this has them all. So we'll take a look here and see how this goes. So I have a very remember, I'm playing against Urza. I'm going second. My opponent has an insane start. And I have a very mediocre draw, but thankfully I've ripped Soul Ring to get myself back into the game. So, opponent... I need this for school supplies. Okay, love. All right. Opponent runs out a memory jar, which means that they're going to be able to, with all the mana that they have access to, they're going to be able to do some real shenanigans next turn. And there isn't a lot I can do about it except possibly Spellseeker. And I decide to get Fragmentize and kill their Crypt. So now if I could have gotten Vandal Blast and killed the Memory Jar. But I figure if I get Fragmentize and kill the Crypt, then and I think this may have been a mistake. This was a little bit of a risk here. But I figured, you know, they're going to get maybe a land drop out of the Memory Jar and some artifact mana. But they're going to be able to play a lot less with 2 less mana available. So, and I have to kill Crypt long term. So I figured by doing it this way, I leave the Vandal Blast in my deck. And you can see I didn't get any free counters or anything. But I leave the VB in my deck, and then I could get that later potentially and clear out all the artifacts that I expect are going to come on the Memory Jar turn. So opponent is doing some very naughty things there. Unfortunately, I do have this Skull Clamp Spellseeker going, so I'm going to lose this whole hand here. We'll put that in the bank for Yawgmoth's Will later, potentially. Top deck a sword, which is pretty nice. But remember, I also had Shackles Force of Will, so some of this was also a little bit of bait, right? So now I get to tap the Skull Clamp and equip the Spellseeker. And hey, look at that, Fierce Guardianship. Now, what's really cool about Fierce Guardianship, for those who didn't know, it says if you control a commander. It doesn't say if you control your commander. Opponent goes for Metamorph here, and I really don't want to have them... I don't want them to have a Shackles, so I force it. Opponent goes for Miscast, and I get to Fierce Guardianship the card. And then slams back to basics. Now, normally this is a house against me, and it's still pretty brutal right here. But look at this rip. Mana Vault off the top. Gonna cast a Sword here. Use the sword itself to equip and swing in. I'm going to go ahead and throw the Skull Clamp on there. That was, in fact, a mistake, but I swing in and my opponent allows me to connect. I wasn't expecting to connect here, so had I not done that, I could have cast Breya right here. I could have tapped the Command Tower for red, the Tundra for white, the Clamp for blue, and the Urborg for black. Put down Breya, and then I would have had 3 more mana available for the turn, which means I could have used Breya. Anyway, my opponent uses his turn and gets a Vedalken Shackles copy. And this is just an amazing situation because, like I said, usually back to basics is just a house against me. But unfortunately for my opponent, now remember I did leave the Vandal Blast in the deck. And this is the other advantage of having Fragmentize, is that you get to save. So we'll stop. So the other advantage of having Fragmentize and Disenchant and Seal is that you get to save Vandal Blast and the other red one. You get to save these cards so that by force, so that when you tutor early for removal, you don't have to go get, like previously I would have, to make the same play when I only had Vandal Blast and Disenchant in the deck. It was a 1 mana play, right? I spent 3 on my 3 on my Spellseeker and 1 on my Fragmentize. So I would have had to have gone and done that with a Vandal Blast in the past. And then from there, with my blast from the past, from there, on this turn, I wouldn't have had access to anything like that. I would have had to like get Will and try to figure out if I could put something together to get enough mana to eke out a VB. And I have to bother with it here. I just Fragmentized early, Vandal Blast late, no problems. And managed to beat it back to basics, which, if you watch a previous video, was repeatedly kicking my butt. Back to Basics was. But, that partially is related to the fact that I ripped that vault right there and I had the sandbag sword and everything. I mean, it all worked out really nicely, but it just felt good to be able to do that. And of course, Fragmentize is a one mana solution to a B2B. So if you get trapped under it, it is a way that you can potentially just go play a land drop, remove the back to basics, get on with the game, which is pretty important, I think. All right. So I got to beat one of the most potent weapons against this deck, which was really good, and I didn't even have a crazy draw, although I managed to pull a Soul Ring, and it got crazy pretty fast after that. All right, so game 2, opponent leads off land Mox Opal, which seems weak, but in reality, because of Urza, like if you notice random artifacts in his deck, keep in mind that those artifacts are all Mox Sapphires. So I'm going to go for a Mystic here. It doesn't stick, but I actually feel that the Mystic is less important than potentially getting a Merchant Scroll into like a Force of Will or something, especially because I have a Teferi in my hand. And then so I'm going to go for that play here. It gets countered, but that gives me a bird for sword, which is pretty nice. I'm sandbagging these blue fetch lands for a couple different reasons. So first of all, I no longer have the Rogrim Tome Triome deck, the one that comes into play tapped. I do still have Mystic Sanctuary in here though. So I prefer to always save blue fetches if possible, so that I can get Mystic Sanctuary so that I can use my fetch as a virtual regrowth. And so there'll be some of the last ones out of my hands. Also, with fetches, I could always draw a Brainstorm, right? So I want to be able to use these cards. I want to be able to use these cards for maximum value, so I don't want to use them whenever possible. On the other hand, there's a pressure to get islands into play because if you draw Vedalken Shackles, you want to be able to shackle something. But against Urza, that pressure is much lower since the card you're always going to be shackling is Urza, and you only need one island for that. I mean, you're just not, like, either the construct's going to be too big and you're not going to be able to shackle it anyway, or the constructs will be small, in which case it won't be a threat and you'll take the real threat anyway. So you're just always going to shackle Urza. All right, anyway, opponent has two blue represented here, but I'm going to go for it anyway, and lucky me it sticks, so I get to bounce the construct and draw a card, which is huge for me. Opponent doesn't have a lot of pressure thanks to the 1/4 facing my 2/2. Is able to clone his Urza, so he gets another construct, and then Mystic Sanctuary is up a counterspell that I'm going to have to play around. It's a mana leak. And then passes for the turn. He's got enough mana to actually activate Urza here, but on the other hand, that would shuffle away the mana leak, which isn't too shabby. Still, I actually don't agree with him getting the mana leak. It's a little bit bold to suggest that he's going to kill my Teferi, because if he doesn't, the mana leak doesn't do anything. Also, keep in mind, Urza doesn't do anything with Teferi out. All right, so I get a Force of Will out of his hand watch. So he can use the Urza, but he can't actually play the card because of the way that Teferi works. All right, so now I'm going to run out a Dak Faden. And of course, I get why he's doing this, but it's not. It will avail him nothing. He gets a miscast, but he can't play it. So I just steal his construct. But the main reason I think, and I'm not sure, but probably the main reason he did that was to tap the construct. He probably should have just tapped it, or maybe to shuffle, realizing he didn't want the mana leak and to tap the construct. So tapping the construct was good because if I didn't have a blocker, he was going to at least be able to attack and kill Dak Faden with Urza, and Dak Faden is a big problem for him as well. On his turn, he goes for a Desperation Urza activation, but of course, he can only play cards on the stack. He can't play instants. He can't play counter spells. There's nothing on the stack. And if he uses them in response to spells, he can't counter because of Teferi. So he has to use it on his main phase here and hope that he hits like a sorcery or an artifact or something that he can play during his main phase. Doesn't work out for him, and he just skips. It's clearly over. The bird that he gave me actually comes back to haunt him. And of course, next turn I get to play Breya. I get to improve my hand. I get to improve my hand further, play a Breya, attack, untap all my mana, kill an Urza if I wish. It's basically done. So we move on to the next set. So that was 2-0, quick 2-0 there. And then we end up with this 2-1 game. So I'm going to have a loss in here. I'm not sure what the challenge is going to be, but this one looks like it's probably not the loss. I would assume this is the win. We'll see, though. All right, so great start on my part. I'm going to go ahead and run out the Tundra here. The main reason... Oh, that sucks. Usually I'd run out the Euroborg because I don't want Tundra to get wastelanded here, but I run out the Tundra because I was hoping that I would then draw a blue land and then I could play a turn 2 Narset. Unfortunately, Mental Misstep shuts down the Soul Ring, so... And I do think that Misstep makes a lot of sense in mono blue because Soul Rings are a problem and you've got to have every chance here. Now this play, mana leaking an end step impulse, not so sure I agree with that one. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just grab a land here and pass. I thought about getting Crypt there, playing Crypt, and then casting Sphenes and returning the Soul Ring and just generating a ton of mana. But I felt like then I just leave a window open for my opponent to play his commander on the next turn. And if I sit with the hand that I have and I prevent, and my opponent makes a play and I actually stop it, exactly like what happened there, then on my turn I can play either Narset or I can play... or I can do nothing, depending, but I can cheat the Soul Ring into play. If I draw a blue land, like I can Sphinx the Soul Ring into play and then play with the extra land that I draw. It doesn't even have to be blue. I can sit on a mana leak. So, there's a lot of things I can do here that look really good. All right, so we're going to see. So anyway, yeah, in this case, I just go for Narset. The activation gets stifled, so I'm not going to find any mana with that. So rough. It's definitely a rough spot here. Opponents had interaction for most of my plays. Uses a Spellseeker to get a mana drain. Mana drain's certainly a problem. I do top deck there and manage to go grab an Enlightened Tutor, which is going to allow me to get down Breya. So now my opponent has a mana drain, but I can play around a mana drain because I have lead on the board. And my opponent, if he doesn't... He can't really dig, he can't use like ponders and stuff to try to find more mana for himself. He actually uses a Chain of Vapor on Breya. Not sure about this play here. It depends, like that Chain of Vapor is pretty valuable for getting Narset off the table or saving the Chain of Vapor for like the end of my turn where I might say attack and leave only one blocker back, and then if he Chain of Vapors the blocker, he can get in and kill Narset. I think that might have been more valuable, but he goes for it, so that's fine. I'm just not going to send the Thopters. I won't replay Breya into a mana drain, certainly. So we're just at a standstill here, but I have lead. All right, end step. I am going to Enlighten Tutor, of course. I'm going to go get Crypt. Try and see if I can draw that mana drain out. I'll go for Monolith. Still doesn't pull it out. I'm sitting on 2 counter spells here, so pretty safe. And of course I'm setting up for a nasty Mind Twist. So this is really just a game of patience here. Opponent has 7 cards in hand, so I may not want to... There's a little bit of a... So when this happens, when your opponent has 7 cards in hand, they're playing blue, they've got counters up, potentially. Of course in this case we know. And you're sitting here, and your hand size is not full. They're under pressure from hand size. So while there's a temptation, like before they get extra mana, to make a play that will interact with them, a good play, sometimes it's for the best to do nothing, because if they don't draw a counterspell, then they have a choice. Do I make a play, or do I go down a card and just discard and end my turn? The correct play for an opponent on a mana drain in this situation would be to draw and discard if they don't find a land. But very few people actually have the discipline to make that play. And if they don't, of course, if he draws and goes, oh, I'll play a artifact mana or something, clearly I would just mana leak that thing or counterspell it, and then follow up with a nasty Mind Twist and just end the game, right? So you got to be cautious here about how you make the plays. There are small plays, small value plays like the Crypt and the Grim that I can use to try to like test for counter magic, but as you can see, I'm not gonna fool around with any of that right here. I'm in such a good spot. Let's just let the pressure of the game. And look, if my opponent does have discipline, as this opponent does, he's just going to discard. And normally, when it's not Echo of Aeons, the card that's being discarded is actually going to cost my opponent a card. So I'm letting the game disrupting scepter my opponent. All right, on his turn, he goes for a Sensei's Divining Top. And while that might not seem like a big deal, it actually is a big deal because what that lets me do, that means that barring free counters, um, my opponent can no longer do something like counter, mana drain plus Flusterstorm, something along those lines. So now by tapping just that one island here, it seems safe. It's actually totally not safe, and I'm gonna be very tempted to push for a play here, especially if I can find some mana. Well, I don't, but I'm gonna tempt my opponent with the Dark Confidant. And actually, because of the Dark Confidant sticking, I decide that I'll go ahead and let him top a little bit more, because now if we maintain, so now if we just let the game run at parity the way that we have been for the last few turns, I'll just be pulling further and further and further ahead because that Dark Confidant stuck. So I tested and then I just I halt my plans to push for a Mind Twist here, simply because we're in great shape. Now remember, my opponent did discard Echo of Aeons, which is a threat because it allows them to refill, but it's not a threat until Narset's off the board. So until then, I don't have to worry about that card at all. Opponent goes for a Merchant Scroll, and I decide I'm going to counterspell it. And the reason I counterspell a Merchant Scroll, which might seem crazy, is that Merchant Scroll will fetch Force of Will, which makes a counter war. I don't have free counters, so I don't want to have to counterspell a Force of Will when I make a play on my turn, because that's 2 mana that I can't spend on my turn for other things, like this big boy. So by counterspelling this now, I'm actually preventing the Force of Will from getting to hand. And then on my turn, I can make a Mind Twist play, and I used Counterspell and not Mana Leak because I only have to leave one blue and a colorless available to run the leak. And like I said, I know that the mana drain's coming, so this is just predicting exactly how the next turn's going to play out and then playing that turn accordingly. So we're going to grab the card off Dark Confidant. Very nice. Necro means that I have a devastating follow-up, and I finally hit some land too, which just makes this turn perfect. So we're going to run a Mind Twist for, I think, pause. Now, why did I float so much mana? So I initially I think I'm going to go for a Mind Twist, but I actually changed my mind. So I float some mana, but I actually play out Urza here because Urza costs me 2 mana, but it actually produces a couple of blue here for me. So I'm going to be totally fine with this. And my opponent tries to mana drain this, I'm going to counter back and then slam him with the Mind Twist anyway. It's going to be one less card in his hand. So I go for it, and he does have to counter. Like you can't let me have an Urza with this much mana on the board. So I agree with that. And then, of course, this is now going to produce. It actually rebates me 2+1 mana because of the construct, and that means that I get to Mind Twist my opponent. I'm going to pause, and if you notice, Flusterstorm, there it was. So the Flusterstorm on that top turn would have been a huge threat. But anyway, if you notice, I actually did it for all but one card, and the reason I didn't do this is because it's stupidly greedy. If my opponent has Daze, if the last card in his hand, the one that wasn't discarded, was a Daze here, and I had tapped that last land, I would feel like such an idiot. But knowing that I have a Narset to prevent any way of refilling his hand means that I don't need to take every card out of his hand. I just need to take almost every card. That's going to be more than sufficient. So playing around Daze here is totally correct, and I can get the rest of the cards with the Yawgmoth's Will and the Mind Twist in a minute. Next turn I can try for a Necro, and if my opponent counterspells it, then I just Sphenes it right back into play anyhow, and then following that up, I'm going to Yawg Will and wreck their hand. I mean, the game is over, right? Like I get to have 2 different ways to play Necropotence here, 3 if you count Flashback on Sphenes. So I'll move into game 3 now. I think that was game. Actually, let me check. Was that game 1 or game 2? I think that was game 2. I think we are on game 3. I think the opponent the first game was the Mental Misstep. But let's take a look. No, I guess that was game 1. Okay. So I get the sets mixed up. Opponent has the absolute stone cold nuts draw for his deck, and yeah, I'm pretty sure this is just one of those ways that you lose. And you can see right here how much I want Disenchant effect. I need one right now so badly, right? Um, and nothing so far. So now I'm just hoping I don't lose immediately to Urza's activated ability or to hand refill. Opponent gets a Mystic Remora. This is just hideously bad for me. And Static Orb, which my opponent can now tap using their Urza. I 100% agree with Static Orb in that deck. Runs a Chain of Vapor out. I foolishly sack, and I do kill their Construct. I don't know if it's totally foolish. I mean, it doesn't trigger the Mystic Remora, and it does get the Construct off the board, so it's not beating me down. Opponent plays Emery here, but it does set me back in mana. And you can see I mean, what am I supposed to do here? I am going to have to give my opponent a card, but I've got to get mana. There is a very small chance I can get in this game. Basically, I get a Crypt here, and then next turn I have to Treachery their Urza, giving him another card, but giving me a chance to get back in the game. Now, I don't play Crypt top here, mainly because, first of all, I don't want to give him 2 cards immediately with the Remora. Secondly, Static Orb would have an impact on what I could untap. I need all of my mana next turn. And then look at, of all the cards from my opponent to Emery back into play, Emery's the Aether Spellbomb, which means I can't run the Treachery play, which means I am totally hosed here. So I run out a Seal of Cleansing, and it's my only hope is that with the one last card in my opponent's hand, the card I'm going to let him draw off Mystic Remora when I play Seal, I'm just hoping it's not a counter, because if I can get the Seal down, then I can deal with the Static Orb, or I can deal with this depending on how I want to do it, and then do like a follow-up play and possibly get in the game. I think what I would have done, I might have let the Orb stay and then played the Crypt and then sat on a Remand, something along those lines, but it doesn't matter because the one card that my opponent drew was a Mana Drain, and I just get wrecked. Sometimes that's the format, and that's okay. It's good that there's, to me, it's good that one deck doesn't always beat another deck. There should always be a way for your deck to win, and if that way involves Soul Ring and Crypt, then so be it. At least it gives you a way to get into the game and to win a game. Not that my opponent's deck is weak and needs the help or anything, but I think it's just one reason why I do think those cards are good for the format. I'm not super bitter about it, and of course, if I had drawn my Disenchants earlier, it might have been a very different game. All right, so we'll move into game 3 here. I have to mulligan, and you get good draw. Now I get good draw. All right, who's playing Urza now? Look at this insanity. First turn Urza with a Mystical Tutor at the end of my opponent's turn. This is gross. I love it. All right. Opponent does have a heck of a start. I don't know what happened with his Mox Diamond right there. I think he was thinking of it like a Chrome Mox. Anyway, I Mystical Tutor. He Mystical Tutors. He goes and gets a Stifle, and I go and get a Mind Twist. Yeah. So, yeah. Welcome to the Stone Cold Nuts. As I said, look, even a deck like mine can win if you get a lucky draw. Anyway, that's also part of the reason why I like having these cards, because fair for you, fair for me, and so that kind of balances out, and then it leaves the games where you only get some of these cards, and we're doing a back and forth, or where you get these good start and then you kill them, and those make for like exciting games, and these just make for fun, absurd, like you get a good chuckle at how like amazing and fun it is to do something broken. And that's okay to me also, because I want to have that fun, but I don't want to have it be mandatory. I don't like it. Like Vintage is out of control right now, literally, which is sad, because it's such a good format potentially, but there's some cards that need to be restricted in Vintage, because right now in Vintage it's totally mandatory that you get absurd starts, and that to me is not fun. But occasionally doing it, that's a blast. All right, so moving to the next set here. And after this, unfortunately, there won't be any games where my opponent's going to win. So you're not going to get to see that. But on the other side, you will get to see this deck doing exactly what you want. So of course, I'm going to keep. This is great because I kill creatures, I kill artifacts. Like I'm covered against a lot of things. My opponent takes a look at my hand, names Vedalken Shackles. I get to, because I have the Biforce, I can afford to waste a Vandal Blast on a first turn Mox here, which turns out to be quite valuable, as you can see. Funny enough, against the Winter Orb, I'm actually playing a land tapped and not untapping it, but it's only because I think about this here and realize like it's too greedy to wait for more targets. I'm going to go ahead and take these out, even though there's a tomb there, and my opponent could be drawing cards. The Winter Orb and Spyglass will disrupt me if I don't get rid of them, so it's time to get rid of them. So having drawn the trinket there, I changed from playing a Breya this turn to the idea of running out Shackles this turn. That way, I'm insulated against my opponent's commander, and at this point, he's had enough. Now, if he had something along the lines of, I was very aware that if my opponent had something along the lines of land back to basics, I could be in big trouble. But keep in mind that if they did make that play, and he's already shown that he's mana poor, if he had made that play, he would have locked down his own tomb also, and then I could have been applying some pressure. I would have had a crypt going. As soon as I find like a fetch with Crucible here, I would be able to do something with that. And also I would have Winter Orb off a Mana Crypt that would allow me to, if my opponent were to get more mana, allow me to pressure his mana back. So I wasn't as concerned with B2B in this specific spot, and that's part of the reason why I just tapped out for the Shackles. And having missed another land, my opponent just gives up. It's behind by a lot of mana. All right, so I'm going to run through this next one here, and I have to take a mulligan in this one, and my opponent leads off with an early Remora, which is unfortunate. It does put a damper on first turn top. I play Tower here. I didn't want to lead with, so normally you want to lead with your second best land. You don't want to lead with your best land if you can because of wastelands and strips. However, in this case, I don't lead with City, and the reason I don't lead with City is that if you lead off with City or Brass, you're actually telling your opponent that your mana base is weak, because you would never lead a City. You only play City when you need City. When it's doing something for you, like fixing a problem with your lands, you don't intend to play this card, right? Like there's no reason you're going to damage yourself constantly on purpose. So I do not like to lead with City of Brass and give the signal to my opponent that, hey, you should really wasteland this because I might be having trouble here. So I lead with Command Tower, which is a strong land. It puts it at risk, but it sends a better signal, a better psychological signal to my opponent that might discourage them from wasting. And considering that they have a Mystic Remora in play, I'm not super concerned that they're going to waste because then they wouldn't be able to pay the upkeep. But there is a chance, of course, that my opponent could do something that involves playing mana, artifact mana and a wasteland. And so I just don't want to, or the Mystic Remora could end up leaving and this signal will be remembered later and my opponent will know what to do further down the road. So now, of course, I draw the Watery Grave and none of this matters. But we're just going to be patient here. Unfortunately, not a lot I can do. Now, if I do get to 4 mana, and there you can see the beginnings of some artifact mana development. If I do get to 4, I can actually run out I can run out my commander. It won't trigger the Remora, and that'll put my opponent under a ton of pressure, and he'll let it go at that point. Here, however, yeah, it's time for that thing to go. And opponent misses a land drop, so no, goes for a Spyglass. There we go. Name's Necro. Of course, I need to kill that for a number of reasons. One of which, the most important of which, isn't actually protecting the Necro. The most important of which is actually I'm going to pause. Making sure that Mox Opal doesn't turn on against an opponent struggling with mana. Now, on this turn, my opponent realized when I made the Disenchant play, he thought I was going to go land and slam the Necro. But actually, yeah, see, he says, I was expecting the Necro, and then he says, this is better. And it's totally right. Like, this play here means that I don't have to worry about back to basics because I've already disenchanted it. And it's going to be real hard for my opponent to do much, right? As soon as we enter combat, I'm going to disenchant that thing. That way we don't exit combat where my opponent has an active crypt going. Now, of course, I can lose to back to basics again, or I can I can struggle with it a bit, but we've also gotten to the point in the game where I get to do this beautiful thing, and I'm going to run out of top. Before I activate the top, I'm actually going to Necro for 6. Then I'm going to activate the top to see what the next 3 cards coming will be. And call it good. And of course my opponent's just totally mana screwed, so I change up the order on the top of my deck only in case I was thinking of getting a card, decide not to. We're going to spin through this pretty quickly. As you can see, I get my commander down, Necro for 1, but I also, on that turn, had used a expedition map to strip mine my opponent. So then on his turn, when he hits a second, he hits what would have been his third land, he's still stuck, and from there, it's pretty trivial. Game's over. All right, so game 2. Once again, though, look at how important these disenchants are. All right. Oh, that was game 2. Apologize. All right. So we're going to run through the last game against KG, and then we'll run through the games against Rototaro, where my opponent's not playing an artifact-based commander against a deck with 5 disenchants, right? And we'll see if it still works out for me. All right. So we're playing, or how well. All right. So I get to. Pardon me. I get to lead off with early top. My opponent leads off with a Codex Shredder, which kind of makes activating a top a little bit awkward. And then we end up having a discussion afterwards. My opponent uses Codex Shredder based on a hunch. He's trying to hit some of his... he uses it on himself. He's trying to hit some of his... incidentally, by the way, that Sapphire Medallion, I probably should have brainstormed in response, but I guess I was sitting on the counter in case there was something coming, like a standstill or something. Anyway, my opponent probably should not have been using the Codex Shredder on himself, and I kind of chat with him about that later, because while it's nice if he hits like his flashback time twister or something along those lines, there's too much risk of hitting a really good card, and that is actually something that I want to talk about briefly, maybe in a video. Not this one, but a video where I'm just chatting about strategy. Anyway, on this turn, he does actually hit me, which was quite damaging. It takes out an Arcane Signet that I needed to get red mana here. So I'm going to Demonic Tutor here. Opponent goes for a mana leak. I'm just going to pay for it. Because I have Force of Negation here, so the punish on the next turn, in which my opponent, now that I'm tapped out, goes for a big play, should be something I can manage thanks to the Force. And so he does go for a big play, and I just force it. I can totally understand why he played the mana leak there, but didn't work out for him here. Now with his last card, runs out of Howling Mine, which is really unfortunate because he's going to get to draw off of it, and I'm not, for as long as that Urza is under his control. However, that Urza is not going to be under his control for long, and as it turns out, getting Treachery over Shackles was quite nice here because now I get to untap 3 lands and make sure that Howling Mine's not under his control either. And while I am tapped out and this could be bad if my opponent draws a Time Twister effect, I'm still in a really good spot. And my opponent mills himself looking for said Time Twister effect and hits back to basics, which would have been one of the ways that he could have won the game. That's exactly what I was saying about not milling himself. But, of course, in hindsight, I know what's going to happen. So I'm going to tutor up a Teachings here, and then I'm just going to go grab a Force of Will. And I just do this right now because my opponent has no cards in hand. I don't mind if I have to Force, but the chances are that I'm not going to have to Force of Will here. However, if I do, and as it turns out I do, okay, I didn't expect the Mana Crypt off the top. But if I do have to Force of Will, it's okay for me because I got Mystical Teachings. I can flash it back and still be in this game just fine. So I force there, and we're gonna take our time here. The plan is I would love to get Vandal Blast, but I can't. Opponent fabricates and gets Aether Spellbomb. So I actually just counter it because Spellbomb would allow him to pick up the Urza, so we don't want that. All right, so I'm going to Vampiric Tutor at the end of my opponent's turn. And since I can't get Vandal Blast, which is what I'd like, let's just try to win the game here. Necropotence, and I still have 2 blue untapped essentially. Pardon me. Sorry. I'm distracted by a little something that I have to attend to. But at any rate, well, as you can see, yeah. Uh, I at this point, I mean, basically, I've got Necropotence out against an opponent with no hand. The game's certainly over. All right, so we'll move into game two.
Yeah.
Best bet if he would have drawn like a time twister there, he could have gotten back into the game potentially, but it was still looking pretty sketchy. I would have mana leaked it just to take away my opponent's mana for the turn, and then used my turn to go after a punish. Here I've got a very fair start
Yeah.
that gets a little bit unfair as soon as I find a mana crypt off Ponder, and my opponent has a Daze. So it is unfortunate for me that I got dazed, but it did act as a sinkhole, which should prove to be pretty good anyway, because I'm gonna be able to get a talisman down here and still be ahead of the game on mana by a good bit. So I'm almost as I'm well. I have 3 to their 1, so I'm just as far ahead on mana as I would have been if the mana crypt had resolved, and my 1 land plus the crypt made 3 to their 1. Of course, I would have played a talisman; it would have been 4 to 1, so it would have actually been slightly better for me, but for the most part, about the same. So I get to run out, copy the talisman, and then play to fairy. It sticks. I'm going to bounce the monolith, which will slow down whatever the play is that's coming as a follow up. And so that gives me a little bit of time here. Like if my opponent plays it again, it's still not that great for them. Instead, he runs out of Trinket into Crypt into Monolith. It's pretty bad news. So a very good start on my opponent's side. But I do have these Planeswalkers. This is a weird game because I am unsure if my opponent truly played this correctly. I do get to go get a mana drain here. Now, I was expecting my opponent to kill Teferi, and then at the end of their turn, I was expecting to cast Fiend's Reclamation and put it right back into play. And or I would mana drain whatever their play is. It depended on what they did. So he runs out the Urza. I think at this point in the game, to be honest, it was pretty late, and my opponent was probably quite tired and was not playing at his he wasn't playing at his absolute best here because he had actually, I think he mentioned something about forgetting that the Teferi was in play there when he played his commander. So he decides to attack Narset here because, of course, he just played a Memory Jar, and Narset Memory Jar is not a good combo for my opponent. But then I impulse into by force, and well, this is kind of what I was talking about with having these extra cards. It's just so good, right? Like that situation over there was looking pretty. Like my opponent was definitely turning this game around pretty well. All of a sudden, not so much. All right, so he's going to go in here, and then this play I question. Hitting the Teferi here at this point doesn't make as much sense. Should have nailed the Narset, I think. He's just giving me so much time with these Planeswalkers, and you just don't want me to have these in play. But I tutor up a Necro, which does not care one iota for Narset. Narset does nothing to me whatsoever here. And with Necro running and double Planeswalkers, opponents not. I mean, I don't know what he's going to do. He's got to if he's got to kind of run out a Time Twister, right? He's got to attack Narset and then Time Twister to try to get cards. I'm thinking, but instead he goes for Teferi, which makes sense. Runs a Mystic Remora out. I respond with Fiends and put Teferi right back into play. My opponent's just pretty frustrated at this point, I believe. And then I'm going to go ahead and just play Soul Ring. Give my opponent an extra card there, but I then get to Mystical Tutor. I get to bounce a permanent, which will draw me a card. I thought, but I didn't account for their Narset. So, oops. So I end up, before bouncing it at the last minute, just plussing Teferi and passing, and realizing, okay, I'm going to pause. Because I realized, so I went to bounce, and then I realized, hey, wait a minute, they got Narset out. This isn't going to work. But then I was thinking, no, it will work because I didn't actually draw a card with Necropotence, so it will actually work because it'll be my first card drawn for the turn. But upon thinking about it, so that was thought number 1, thought number 2, thought number 3 was, wait a minute, there's a much better play. Plussing Teferi here means that I can play this card as an instant, which means I can wait till their draw step. And since they've already drawn a card, I'll trigger Mystic Remora, sure. But they're not going to get to draw off of it because the Narset's still in play. So Yeah, why don't I? And then they can't even counter back. So why don't I just like mind twist you and time walk at the same time? That seems good. My opponent agrees and scoops. Okay. One moment. Sorry for the pause here. All right. So now I'm going to run through these games against Rototaro. I apologize for the dead space there, and and Dragon 7K, and you'll see. I don't change the deck at all. It's not like I go, okay, well now I'm not facing Urza. Let me take out all my disenchants. I really do believe that this is correct. Now, these may not be the correct ones. They feel right to me, but they might not be. I feel like, for example, there is Kolaghan's Command is an extremely good disenchant, a very powerful card that I would like to play in here. The thing is, I'm not sure that it's better than the ones I've selected for this deck. And part of the reason is because, well, back to basics, Sylvan Library, and cards like that, the enchantment-based cards that are a problem are a huge problem. And also, Kolaghan's Command on 3 contrasted against a disenchant effect like Seal of Cleansing on 2, when you're talking about a Soul Ring, is a big deal, right? Like I can go land, they go land Soul Ring, and I go land Seal of Cleansing, and that's a huge deal versus land pass. They do make a big 4-drop, and then on my turn I finally K command it. Now I'm tapped out, and if their 4-drop accelerated them further, like a Thran Dynamo, I kill the Dynamo. Now they make a 5-drop. It's just snowballs where I'm losing because it was just slow. So while it's powerful, power versus speed. Speed is actually quite often more powerful than power in a weird way. So yeah. So anyway, I leave it all as is. And this opponent is playing Sen triplets, and I think to myself, well, I certainly don't mind having extra disenchants against that commander. And we'll see how this goes. So my opponent runs a turn 2 Isochron Scepter, and then inexplicably, much like my previous opponent, who failed to discard for their mocks, this opponent doesn't imprint anything on their scepter. So I just don't even bother worrying about it. I just go get a mana crypt. I have no idea what happened here. It had to have felt really terrible, though. I mean, I wouldn't have felt good if I were them about that scenario. So I just run out Seal of Cleansing, Coalition Relic. I'm kind of testing the waters, right? Like I want to ferry the most. Incidentally, I want to point this out. Seal of Cleansing, Svine's Reclamation is actually a combo. This actually lets you recur a disenchant, which is super cool, right? All right, so anyway, on my opponent's turn, they play land, Coalition Relic, charge, and look at this. I'm just getting everything. I draw another disenchant. I'm going to run out to Fairy and bounce that thing, and the reason that I make that play is that I can now play my commander. Remember, I have that Skull Clamp out. I've got Seal of Cleansing. I have an extra mana. I'm going to clamp and immediately draw cards. I'm not worried about something like a Back to Basics here because I have a Seal of Cleansing in play. And if my opponent does what I think that they're going to do, which is replay the Coalition Relic, well, it's already dead on board. Opponent just plows there. He should have played Relic, Swords to Plowshares, unless he's sitting on a counterspell, so I figure that's what's going on. Then I'm looking closely at the board and going, wait, I have a Teferi. It doesn't matter if you're sitting on a counterspell. That doesn't make any sense. Anyway, opponent runs out their Coalition Relic, charges. At the end of their turn, I get to do shenanigans. I'm going to Impulse into Urza, Ponder into, I guess, a Dynamo. Is that what I take? Yeah. Disenchant their Relic, leaving my Seal of Cleansing in play, which is another nice thing. It just sits there being a problem for them until it gets forced. Plus up to Fairy on my turn. Run out Breya into Urza, which is almost a... It's not a net positive mana play, but it's going to generate tons of mana down the road. And of course, with the last mana that I've got, I fabricate Slam a Winter Orb. I've got exactly a Coalition Relic untapped, plus a Winter Orb, so it means I can actually tap for 2 blue if I had a reason to. I can bluff it, I guess. But anyway, that's it. And my opponent scoops. He's locked under Orb against this board with just nothing. And of course, his best out would be something like a Soul Ring or a Crypt, but there's a Seal of Cleansing sitting in play waiting for him. So my opponent comes back and maybe tests to see if it was a fluke, and I believe brings the same commander again. Oh no, comes back with a different commander. One, probably another for fun commander, but fun in a different way that they want to test. Now I'm going to pause here. This guy is using Tetsuo Umezawa, who can't be the target of aura spells, and for 4 mana kills a tapped or blocking creature. That is way too slow for the format. If you want to play these colors, the correct card to play in these colors, if you're assuming you're not going to play something like, if you want to play an old school card, like a Legends card, is Mariki Ree Barrett. She's the whore. She's if you want to know why I said that, you'll have to take a look at the photo. But basically, and I don't say it with any disrespect intended, I just think that it's amusing how people could draw things at that time. It's amusing to me how the art at that time was totally just whatever you imagine, put it in the art, and now everything's like tippy-toeing around, I don't know. I'm not happy with the Wizards of the Coast band on Crusade. Let's just put it that way. Anyhow, Mariki Ree Barrett, though, she is 4 mana, but she's blue-red-black. She's Grixis. She's a slightly bigger creature, I think. And she taps to make your opponent randomly discard, which is gnarly, right? Like, tapping to make your opponent randomly discard in control colors is brutal. It's a slow mind twist over time. It's a reusable hymn to Torok. I mean, however you want to look at it. And then in those colors, and I don't remember if I built a deck around this or not for the channel, there's also a land. There's a legendary land. It's a blue land that untaps a legendary creature, I believe. And so you can actually play that with her. So you can like double pump her. At any rate, the point is she's pretty doggone good. And if my opponent happens to be watching this, I highly recommend that should you want an old school commander, you don't want to play something more modern like Kess, you take a look at Mariki. Anyway, but that's an aside, so we'll wrap this up. And as you can see, I'm just going to run out. I run out Strip Mine into Expedition Map. Never a happy scenario, but my mana was a little bit weak, and I figured if they strip the strip, it's a bummer, but it's less of a bummer than if they take out my only source of colored mana. And if they don't, then of course I get to do this. And this does mean that my Mox Opal will take a little bit longer to come on board. I'm going to bounce the Archivist. I don't want him refilling his hand with a reusable windfall effect. At least for now, it's going to buy me some time. My opponent DTs, so I figured somehow Teferi was going to die. It's going to be Lightning Bolt or something. Plays a Mind Crank. I don't understand this at all. So this is, while I felt like my opponent must have been getting their serious deck, this must not be, right? Anyway, on my turn, I'm just going to run out a ton of mana and kill one of their lands and pass. Mind Crank does a little bit of damage to the Mana Crypt. I don't care at all. They play Tetsuo Umezawa. I don't care at all. Now I've got double Wasteland, and so it's going to be pretty gnarly for my opponent. I lose some more cards to Mana Crypt, Mind Crank. Doesn't matter. Lose some more cards. I mean, if I hit Svine's Reclamation or Yawgmoth's Will or any of the other ways that I can recur my graveyard, there's just a huge punish here. I get to run out the sword, smash them, take a card out of their hand, take 2 more mana sources. I wasn't done with the abuse. It was still coming. I was going to tap for 5 there and play Teferi. I was going to then Vandal Blast away the Mind Crank and tuck the commander and leave my opponent with literally just 1 land in play. But before I can finish the nasty turn, my opponent concedes. I mean, alternately, the other play that I had considered was I just run out my commander here, totally ignore Umezawa and Mind Crank, and then tap the Mana Crypt and clamp the commander and clamp the little birds and draw some cards, or even slide the Sword of Feast and Famine over. However you want to cut this, any of those plays would have been fine, and this game is definitely over. So he comes back with a third deck, and this time it's clear this is his serious deck, hey, I don't want to play this deck in general public because, this isn't even fun for people. But, if you're playing a hardcore deck, I'll play a hardcore deck. This is the impression that I have based on what this commander is. And it is one of the strongest commanders in the format. It is Zur the Enchanter. It may be the strongest commander in the format because of Necropotence. And I have to take a mulligan, and then I have to take a mulligan again. So I double mulligan. Look at my situation, and one of the cards that I end up having to get rid of is Necro. I just don't have the black mana to support it here. I ended up keeping Duretti, but it's really risky because I am actually 1 mana short of getting Duretti active. But Duretti is a hope. If Duretti does get on the board, I can keep Zur off the board, and that's worth it. Plus, I have an early, once again, Fragmentize to save me from early fast mana starts a little bit. That might mean that Zur, I get time to find the mana to get the Duretti so that I can stay in this game. So double mulligan going first. I'm down 3 cards. My opponent has 7 cards in hand and I have 4. But it's going to have to try to do. All right, so I'm going to develop mana here. Of course, I'm not going to run out the Jete just yet. And I don't have anything to do this turn, so I actually play the Jete. And the reason that I do this, I could have maybe Mind Twisted for 2 or something, but the reason I play the Jete there is, first of all, if my opponent just counters it, fine, I get a counter out of their hand for a card that I don't really intend to use. But secondly, this actually gives me a card that I can give up to Duretti. If I need to play Duretti and sack an artifact, I don't want to sack mana when I'm already struggling here. So opponent runs out Reliquary Tower and then Mystical Tutors for counterspell. That seems pretty aggressive. On my turn, I'm going to Mind Twist them for 2, and I actually get a mana leak out of their hand. And I apologize, but I actually am going to have to cut this short. I'm actually getting paged, so not paged, but effectively paged. Yeah, bottom line is I'm gonna finish this game up, and then we're gonna call it. Okay. 1 second here. So opponent does get Zur out. Basically, I'm going to run through. I'm going to actually just kind of call it here. I apologize. Here's what happens though. He plays the Zur and I find the mana for Duretti. I kill it exactly the way I wanted to. Opponent can't really do anything, and from there I just build up tons of counters, and the pressure from Duretti forces him to make plays. I'm able to disenchant end of turn artifact mana, and my opponent does get an Isochron down and tries to set up with a counter spell. And on my turn, I fragmentize the Isochron. My opponent taps Isochron to counter the fragmentize, which allows me to make another play that was much more backbreaking. And from there, and then shortly after that, I Duretti the Isochron off the board. And then my opponent just has nothing. So I do apologize. I'm going to have to cut this video short. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching the games, though. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.